REST is a representational state transfer, a design pattern used for application integrations. It's used in the client-server architectures to communicate between client and server. It's a stateless protocol. It's not a protocol, say, it's a pattern. It's a stateless. No client information is stored between the GET requests, and each request is separate and unconnected, meaning we don't maintain the session and then associate data between a session between each request. There are different methods allowed. These are HTTP methods: get, put, delete, post, patch. REST key elements: resource, resource identifier, request headers and request body, response, response header, and response body, and response status codes. So we already discussed what is a resource identifier and header and body for the request, and then response body, response message, response header, and response body, response status codes in the previous lecture. In REST, understanding the resource is important. So let's say we have a server where we want to represent some of the data on the server. If the data we need to represent on the server, data will has to be provided by the client. So let's say we have a client as well. Now I want to send the user details, or I want to create on the user details on the server, then the client is going to send user details to the server with an resource identifier slash user. Server saves that information on the server side. So once server saves that resource identifier will become slash user, and user is the object or a resource. So it's very important to understand each object what you want to represent on the server is a resource. And each resource is identified with a unique resource identifier. At the same time, you can represent more than one item inside the resource identifier. For example, if the slash user is a list of users, then resource identifier slash user itself identifies list of users as the resource. So there are different methods are allowed: patch, delete, post, put, get, user, slash user. Slash user is the resource identifier. Patch, delete, post, put, get is the method names. If you remember the HTTP message format, the start line contains the method name, and then it contains the path, which is actually resource identifier, and then HTTP protocol version number. So you could relate right now the REST message or REST request will be equivalent to the HTTP request, and we use exact HTTP protocol to implement the REST pattern. Example for representing a resource array of objects. There are different HTTP request methods are supported by the HTTP protocol. The get, post, put, delete, patch, head, options, trace, connect. This is a table which explains different methods, and it has a request body or not, and response body or not, is it safe or idempotent or cacheable. There is a term CRUD being used in many places. So CRUD stands for create, read, update, delete. With respect to the REST, CRUD directly maps to the post, get, put, delete. So that's the recommendation. So if you want to create a resource, use post. If you want to read, get. If you want to update, use update. And if you want to delete, just use delete method. Here is an example of resources in REST. So when you get the first line, if you see here, the get API v1 user is the resource identifier, and you're trying to get that resource, and then it goes and gets as 200 OK. Put, when you're putting with the resource identifier, you're sending the ID and then first name and role. Let's say ID is the exact identifier to identify, let's say, then we are going to represent that and then put that resource on the server side and then send 204 no content. There's a response no content as a response status code. Post is exactly the same. User use one of these to create. In the previous recommendation, we said post is used to create, and post is not idempotent. Put is idempotent. If you send user object multiple times, it will be creating multiple times on the server side. You have to be careful. To replace, we use or edit, we use put. That means you are identifying the identifier with a unique identifier, and you should be replacing that object. Patch is specific to the updating a specific portion of the body or resource. Here, I am trying to just update the first name. Then this is how I would be using when I am updating a particular parameter. Delete is for deleting a given path or a resource identifier, and it will give you a response code 204. There are several response codes supported for HTTP response. HTTP 100 series are the HTTP informational codes. 200 series is successful codes. 300 is the redirection codes. 400 is the client error codes. 500 is the server error codes. 100 is mostly the informational codes as mentioned. 200 codes are most important ones are 200 okay, that means all good. 201 is created. 202 is accepted. 203 no authoritative information. 204 is no content. Created no content. That's a 204. If you want to just respond created with the content, you can use 201. If you want to use 204 no content when you execute post, it's an option. 205 reset content. 206 is a partial content, and then 207 is a multi-status. 208, 226. Mostly in my lifetime, I used 200, 201, 202. I did not use 203. I used 204, 205, 206, and 207. So these are the mostly in my lifetime I used, and mostly used successful codes are 200, 201, 204. 206, 207, 205 are very rarely used. HTTP redirection codes 300, 301, and 304 are mostly used, I would say. In my work projects for the last 20 years, I would have used 301 and 304 mostly. So 400 series is the client error codes. It's like a 400 bad request. For example, you're sending a request, you are not sending the body in a correct format, then you would get 400. Let's say you are sending a parameter which is unknown to your server, then it's a 400 error. If one of the parameters is missing, then it's a 400 error. 401 is unauthorized. If your user is not authorized, then you would get 401. Then 402 is a payment required. So that is related to the payments. 403 is forbidden. So if your user is authenticated but it's not authorized to access the information, then it's a 403 returned. 404, if the page is not found. 405 is a method not allowed. Meaning, let's say you are trying to access a resource identifier, but that method, HTTP method, is not allowed by the server. Then you would get 405 on it. 406 not acceptable. There are so many other. In mostly we use 400 to 406 and then 408, 409. So these are the error codes I used in my lifetime. 408 is a request timeout. 409 is a conflict. That means all are good. I'm trying to update to the resource, but there is some kind of conflict where some threading issues or something is locking that resource. In those special cases, you can return 409. 500 is the server side error codes. Most of the cases we see 500 internal server error. There is 502, that's a bad gateway, where if the gateway cannot route the request, you would, and service unavailable if the server is down. 503, 504 is a gateway timeout. So 500, 502, 503, 504 are mostly used codes in day-to-day life.